The Supreme Court chamber fell silent as Justice Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her voice sharp and deliberate, and unleashed a stunning attack on Representative Jasmine Crockett. Gasps rippled through the air like shockwaves, the kind of audible disbelief that can only come when power strikes in a place it was never meant to. Every head in the room turned, every eye widened, and for a single suspended moment, history seemed to freeze. Crockett sat still, her gaze steady, her presence unshaken. But around her, the weight of the institution pressed down like a storm. The marble walls of the chamber seemed to echo Barrett's words with a cold finality, as though the building itself wanted to remind everyone of its authority. Reporters' pens stopped mid-sentence. Staffers exchanged nervous glances. The tension was so thick it could be sliced apart with a knife. Barrett didn't whisper. She didn't hedge. Her attack carried the arrogance of someone who believed she could say anything without consequence, that her robe and title granted her immunity from accountability. The disdain in her tone was impossible to miss, dripping from every syllable. For some, it was a shocking breach of decorum. For others, it was the mask finally slipping. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply absorbed the blow in silence, her stillness more powerful than any instant retort. That quiet composure radiated through the chamber, unsettling those who expected her to shrink back. She was not just a congresswoman being scolded. She was the living embodiment of every American who had ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to know their place. The tension escalated with each passing second. Every person in the room knew they were witnessing more than a verbal jab. This was a confrontation that cut to the heart of America's divisions. Power against principle, arrogance against dignity. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just make headlines but etches itself into memory. But what came next would send shockwaves far beyond that chamber. It would spill into the news cycle, explode across social media, and ignite conversations in living rooms across the country. Because when Barrett attacked Jasmine Crockett, she set into motion a chain of events that no one, not even Barrett herself, could have predicted. To understand why that moment in the Supreme Court chamber mattered, you have to step back and see the battlefield it stood upon. Jasmine Crockett was not simply another lawmaker caught in a clash of words. She had become a lightning rod, a rising figure whose voice carried the weight of communities too often silenced. She represented a generation unafraid to call out hypocrisy, a woman who refused to shrink in spaces where she was never meant to belong. Crockett's presence in that chamber symbolized more than politics. She embodied the story of democracy under siege, of women fighting for agency, of Black Americans demanding the dignity too long denied them. Every time she spoke, it was not just her voice. It was the echo of history itself, resonating with the rhythms of struggle and resilience. Her critics saw her as too loud and too direct, too unapologetic. But for millions across the nation, she was exactly what America needed. Someone willing to speak truth even when the walls of power tried to drown her out. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Across the country, state houses were rolling back voting rights. Courts were narrowing protections. Movements for justice were being branded as threats. The same themes played out again and again. Who gets to decide what America looks like, who belongs, and who has to fight just to be seen? Jasmine Crockett's voice cut into those questions with fearless clarity, and that made her dangerous to those invested in keeping the old order intact. Justice Barrett's presence, too, carried its own symbolism. Elevated to the highest court by forces eager to lock in power, she represented for many the entrenchment of a narrow vision of America, one that privileged hierarchy over equality, control over freedom. When she spoke down at Crockett, it wasn't simply judge to representative. It was the weight of centuries of exclusion bearing down on the woman who dared to stand unbowed. That is why the silence in that chamber was so heavy. Everyone knew this wasn't a small skirmish. It was a proxy battle for something far larger. Democracy itself seemed to sit in the balance. Was America a nation that silenced women of color when they spoke truth? Or was it a nation that would finally fully hear them? Was it a place where titles and robes could be used as weapons? Or a place where justice meant more than power? This wasn't just a clash of words, one commentator would later write. It was a clash for the soul of the nation. And in that instant, millions watching from afar felt it in their bones. The chamber wasn't merely filled with marble and history. It was filled with the weight of identity, belonging, and truth itself. But if anyone thought Barrett would hold back, they were mistaken. Because after that first sharp attack, she leaned in even further, her voice steady, her words dripping with the kind of confidence that only comes when you think you cannot be touched. The tension snapped tighter. The room seemed to shrink, and suddenly everyone realized the confrontation was far from over. And that's when Barrett decided to go for the jugular. To understand the gravity of that moment, you have to understand who Justice Amy Coney Barrett has become in the American imagination. Draped in the black robe of neutrality, she carries herself with the air of calm restraint, as if she floats above politics, untouched by bias. But for many, the record tells a different story, one of quiet, calculated decisions that have reshaped rights, shifted power, and left millions wondering whether the scales of justice had been tilted long before they ever entered her courtroom. From the very start of her rise, Barrett's path was marked by controversy. Appointed to the Supreme Court in the turbulent final days of a presidency defined by division, her confirmation hearings unfolded like a compressed political storm. She sat in front of senators insisting she would be a neutral arbiter, that her personal faith and ideology would never interfere with her rulings. Yet even as those words left her lips, critics pointed to her record on issues like reproductive rights and civil liberties as proof that neutrality was little more than theater. Her opinions, measured and polished, often masked what activists called a consistent pattern, siding with corporations over workers, narrowing the scope of protections for women, immigrants, and marginalized communities. Time and again, she invoked the language of restraint, claiming fidelity to the Constitution's text. But to many, that restraint looked less like neutrality and more like selective blindness, a refusal to acknowledge the lived realities of those without privilege or power. And perhaps most striking was the contrast she embodied. Barrett liked to speak of family, of humility, of the simple virtues of everyday life. But in the courtroom, her decisions reflected an entirely different image. A woman wielding immense power with cold precision, seemingly unmoved by the human consequences of her words. To her supporters, this was strength, a justice who would not be swayed by emotion. To her critics, it was arrogance dressed as principle. Consider the way she spoke during arguments, the clipped tone, the sharp interruptions. Even in moments that demanded empathy, Barrett's demeanor carried the unmistakable air of someone convinced her view of the law was superior, final, untouchable. It was not just the substance of her rulings but the way she delivered them, with the confidence of authority, and the assurance that she would face no consequences. And that was precisely why her clash with Jasmine Crockett was so electrifying. Because Barrett's power was not just judicial, and it was symbolic. She represented the enduring fortress of elitism, the notion that a handful of unelected voices could determine the rights and futures of millions. When she looked down from the bench, it was not merely a glance. It was centuries of hierarchy staring down at the voices that tried to rise. But contradictions followed her like shadows. She spoke of women's empowerment even as her rulings restricted choices. She claimed to honor the rule of law even as she aligned with the very forces attempting to narrow who counted fully as American. She presented herself as calm, impartial, above the fray, yet every decision seemed to reinforce the power of the already powerful. It was this tension, this dual image, that gave her the air of a villain in the unfolding drama. Not a villain who shouted, but one who quietly rewrote the rules in her favor. Her critics argued she was a product of the very machinery that sought to roll back progress, elevated not for her independence but for her loyalty to a cause. And every time she cloaked her words in the language of legal restraint, it reminded people of how injustice so often hides behind polite words and procedural tones. Barrett carried herself as though she were invincible. She had the robe, the title, the lifetime appointment. She had the institutional armor that generations of justices before her had used to shield themselves from criticism. To her, a confrontation with a younger, less powerful representative might have seemed trivial, even laughable. After all, she was the justice. Crockett was just one more voice in a chamber filled with noise. But therein lay the flaw. Because arrogance often blinds its bearer to what it cannot control. For all her power, all her training, all her certainty, Barrett had never faced the storm of authenticity, conviction, and lived truth that Jasmine Crockett carried with her into that chamber. And soon, Barrett would discover that the authority of a robe is no match for the courage of a woman who has spent her life refusing to be silenced. But Barrett had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Long before Jasmine Crockett sat in that chamber staring down the sharp words of Justice Barrett, her story was already one written in struggle, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that truth must always have a voice. Crockett's journey was not paved with privilege or entitlement. It was carved through the long nights of work, the pressure of expectation, and the weight of representing communities too often overlooked. She came from the grit of working-class America, raised with the values that so many immigrants and strivers know by heart, that nothing is given, everything is earned, and your dignity is your armor in a world eager to strip it away. Every challenge she faced was a test of resolve. Every obstacle was a question: will you shrink or will you rise? And Crockett chose time and again to rise. Her path into politics was never about ambition for its own sake. It was about survival, about defending those whose lives were written off by systems designed to forget them. As a lawyer, she stood in courtrooms where the balance of justice leaned heavily against the powerless. She saw firsthand how wealth and influence could buy outcomes, while ordinary people were left to fend for themselves. Those experiences shaped her into something more than an advocate. They made her a fighter, a voice unwilling to be quieted, a woman who carried the stories of her clients like scars that could not be erased. And yet, what defined Jasmine Crockett was not anger but dignity. She learned early that outrage alone could not win battles. It was composure, the ability to remain steady under fire, to hold one's ground while others tried to provoke, dismiss, or diminish. That composure became her signature, the calm center in the storm of politics, the unspoken reminder that dignity is a weapon far sharper than arrogance. Her rise to Congress was not a coronation. It was a battle. She faced skepticism at every turn, whispers that she was too bold, too young, too outspoken to survive in the cutthroat world of Washington. But those whispers only fueled her determination. Every attack reminded her of what she represented: the daughters of immigrants, the working mothers juggling multiple jobs, the young black women told again and again that their voices didn't belong in halls of power. Crockett carried all of them with her, and with every step she took, she proved that their place was not just in the audience but at the microphone, at the table, at the center of the debate. What set her apart was her refusal to play by the script written for her. She didn't soften her words to make others comfortable. She didn't dilute her convictions to fit into a mold. And that authenticity, raw and unfiltered, made her dangerous to the establishment. It was the kind of danger that doesn't come from violence but from truth. The danger of a woman who cannot be bought, cannot be silenced, cannot be shamed into retreat. When Jasmine Crockett walked into that Supreme Court chamber, she carried more than her title. She carried the weight of countless struggles, the sacrifices of her family, the long nights of study, the relentless fight for clients who had nothing but their voices. Every scar, every setback, every moment of doubt had prepared her for the confrontation ahead. She was not simply a representative facing down a justice. She was the culmination of generations who had fought to be heard, a living answer to the arrogance of power. And when Barrett leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension, Crockett did not see just one woman in a robe. She saw the centuries of gatekeepers who had tried to close doors in her face. She saw the history of women told to sit quietly, while others decided their futures. She saw the countless moments when truth was spoken but dismissed because it came from the wrong mouth. But this time things would be different. This time she would not let silence stand. In that chamber, all those battles had prepared her for this very moment. She was ready not just to defend herself, but to defend the principle that dignity could not be trampled by arrogance, no matter how high the bench or how heavy the robe. So when Justice Barrett attacked, expecting perhaps hesitation, embarrassment, or retreat, Jasmine Crockett delivered something else entirely. When Barrett attacked, Crockett didn't flinch, she fired back. Barrett's words fell like stones into the chamber, each one carefully chosen to sting, each one meant to remind everyone present exactly who held the higher ground in that room. She questioned Crockett's credibility with the sharpness of a blade disguised as inquiry. She framed her barbs as neutral observations, but there was nothing neutral about them. They carried the unmistakable tone of dismissal, the kind that said, "You don't belong here. You're out of your depth. Sit down." For a moment, it seemed the room itself tilted toward Barrett's authority. She leaned into the silence, punctuating each phrase with the weight of her title. It was the kind of performance she had perfected, calm, precise, dressed in the language of law but dripping with condescension. And around her the marble echoed those words back with a chill. But Crockett did not bite. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush to defend herself with fire or fury. Instead, she let the words hang in the air, refusing to dignify them with immediate reaction. Her silence became its own kind of power, her stillness a rebuke louder than any shout. She sat with the poise of someone who had endured worse, someone who knew that sometimes the strongest answer is patience. The chamber noticed. Reporters scribbled frantically. Staffers shifted in their seats. Even those accustomed to the predictability of hearings felt something unusual building. The tension was thick, as if the very oxygen in the room had slowed down. Crockett's composure unsettled the rhythm Barrett tried to command. So Barrett pressed harder. Her words sharpened, the questions now barbed with implication. She gestured with her hand as if to physically dismiss Crockett from the conversation. The arrogance bled through more plainly now, no longer hidden behind the mask of neutrality. It was authority weaponized, the insistence that power alone made her right. And still Crockett did not break. She absorbed the blows like a prize fighter studying her opponent's moves. Each barb became data, each insult a preview of the arrogance she was about to dismantle. Her eyes never left Barrett's face, steady and unflinching, as if to say, "I see you, and I am not afraid." The longer Crockett held her ground, the more the balance shifted. The silence after Barrett's words no longer felt like dominance. It felt like anticipation. It felt like the audience waiting for the inevitable snap of the trap that was being set. Barrett could sense it too, and that only pushed her further. She doubled down, her voice tightening, her phrasing more pointed, her confidence more brittle. It was a duel now, not of volume, but of presence. One woman wielded the power of office, the other wielded the unshakable strength of authenticity. The clash was not loud, but it was seismic, and everyone in that room knew they were on the edge of something historic. Crockett leaned back ever so slightly, her face composed, her voice calm as she prepared to respond. The chamber leaned with her, every ear straining, every eye locked. It was the pause before the storm, the heartbeat before the drop. The room braced itself, because Crockett was about to turn the tables. The silence that followed Barrett's final barb was suffocating. You could almost hear the chamber breathing in unison, waiting for Jasmine Crockett's reply. Barrett's eyes were steady, her lips pursed, her body language telegraphing the certainty of someone who believed she had just delivered a fatal blow. But Crockett's stillness was not defeat. It was calculation. It was the pause of someone who understood that timing is as much a weapon as words. She inhaled slowly, leaned forward, and let her first sentence fall with deliberate calm. "With all due respect, Justice Barrett." The phrase was polite on its surface, but the tone carried steel. Reporters lifted their pens. The room stiffened. Crockett was not raising her voice. She didn't need to. She was peeling back the layers of Barrett's attack, exposing the arrogance underneath without ever breaking composure. Every pause was a drumbeat, every glance a spotlight. When Crockett cited the values that had guided her work, equality, fairness, justice for those unheard, the murmurs began. Not loud but audible. Nods appeared in the gallery. Even those who rarely reacted in chambers couldn't help themselves. They saw a woman not crumbling under pressure but rising higher with each word. Barrett shifted in her chair. It was subtle, a slight tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. But the cracks in her composure were visible to anyone watching closely. Crockett had found the opening, and now she pressed forward with the precision of someone who had been waiting her whole life for this moment. She reminded the chamber, without naming names, that power without accountability is not justice. That authority does not grant moral superiority. She layered her points carefully, building tension like a conductor guiding an orchestra toward crescendo. "We are not here," she said, voice steady, "to silence the inconvenient truths of the people we serve. We are here to face them, to answer them, to honor them." A camera flash popped. Gasps fluttered across the rows. Crockett had not raised her voice, yet the force of her words rippled outward like a shockwave. Barrett, so controlled, now looked less like the untouchable arbiter of law and more like someone caught in the glare of a spotlight she could not dim. And Crockett wasn't finished. She began to dismantle Barrett's earlier points one by one, not with venom but with precision. Each rebuttal landed like a brick in a wall, constructing an unassailable defense of her integrity and the communities she represented. She quoted constitutional principles, not as abstract theory, but as promises America had yet to fulfill. She wove her personal story into the larger American story, of struggle, resilience, and refusal to be erased. Every line landed harder than the last. Murmurs swelled into audible agreement. A few in the chamber exchanged knowing looks, some even suppressing smiles as if they had just witnessed a rare reversal, the underdog not only surviving the assault, but commanding the stage. Barrett leaned back slightly, her earlier confidence waning. She tried to interject at one point, but Crockett's momentum was unstoppable. With the calm authority of lived truth, she held her ground, her tone never wavering. "When you dismiss me," she said, locking eyes with Barrett, "you don't just dismiss Jasmine Crockett. You dismiss every American who has been told their story doesn't matter." That line drew an audible gasp. A moment of silence followed, heavy and charged, before whispers cascaded like a wave through the chamber. Crockett's words were no longer about her alone. She had reframed the attack as an attack on dignity itself, on the millions whose identities and struggles mirrored her own. Barrett's expression hardened. Her attempts to appear unbothered were betrayed by the quickened tapping of her fingers against the bench. The robe, the title, the authority. None of it shielded her from the truth being laid bare in real time. Crockett leaned in again, delivering her final strokes with the precision of a surgeon. She contrasted arrogance with service, elitism with sacrifice, authority with empathy. Each phrase was sharp enough to stand on its own, yet together they built toward a devastating climax. The audience knew it. The murmurs grew louder, rippling into suppressed applause that etiquette barely contained. Crockett was no longer simply defending herself. She was delivering the speech of a lifetime, the kind of moment that would outlive the chamber, the headlines, and the news cycle. And then she paused. The room froze. Even the air seemed to hold still, bracing for what would come next. Crockett's eyes swept the chamber, her voice calm but commanding as she delivered the final line that landed like thunder. And then, the line that would explode across the internet. The chamber itself had been shaken, but it was the world outside those marble walls that felt the full force of Jasmine Crockett's counterattack. Within minutes, phones were buzzing. Clips of her mic drop moment were clipped, captioned, and sent flying into the endless churn of social media. Hashtags ignited like wildfire. Crockett clapback, dignity wins, Barrett exposed. On TikTok, users remixed her words into rhythmic chants. On Twitter, her lines were quoted and retweeted by the thousands. By nightfall, Crockett's name wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Memes arrived almost instantly. One viral post showed Barrett leaning forward in the chamber, juxtaposed with Crockett's calm, cutting reply, the caption reading, "When arrogance meets truth." Another painted Crockett as a superhero, cape flowing, standing unbowed before a robed figure crumbling under the weight of their own ego. These weren't just jokes, they were declarations. The internet had chosen its hero, and they were ready to amplify her voice louder than any chamber microphone could. Commentators rushed to their cameras and keyboards. Cable news anchors replayed the moment on loop, dissecting Crockett's delivery, her poise, her devastating precision. Some called it the rare instance when the underdog didn't just survive, she redefined the battle. Progressive hosts hailed it as proof that authenticity can triumph over arrogance. Even more centrist voices admitted they hadn't seen a takedown that clean in years. The consensus was clear. Barrett had underestimated her opponent, and the world had watched the reversal live. Celebrities piled on next. Musicians, actors, and athletes quoted Crockett's lines in solidarity, flooding Instagram and Twitter with support. One A-list actress shared a photo of Crockett with the caption, "That's how you hold power accountable." A popular rapper dropped a freestyle sample using her words as the hook. Politicians, too, weighed in, some praising Crockett for standing tall, others scrambling awkwardly to defend Barrett's performance. But the tide was unmistakable. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She had become a symbol. The ripple effects reached beyond commentary. Young activists watching from dorm rooms and community centers felt a surge of energy. For them, Crockett's moment was proof that the chamber doors were not impenetrable, that voices like theirs could not only enter but dominate the conversation. Organizers clipped her lines into motivational videos, splicing them with footage of marches, protests, and chants. Within days, local rallies began to echo her phrasing. What had begun as one woman's response was transforming into a chorus. Even late-night comedy couldn't resist. Hosts replayed Barrett's barbs with exaggerated smugness, only to follow it with Crockett's knockout reply, drawing thunderous laughter from studio audiences. Skits went viral, caricaturing Barrett's haughty demeanor and Crockett's cool composure. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was pop culture. And once a political moment becomes pop culture, it becomes nearly impossible to erase. Barrett, for her part, retreated into silence. Her allies tried to downplay the incident, calling it overblown, accusing the media of sensationalism. But every denial only fueled the fire. The more they insisted the clash wasn't important, the more it became obvious that it was. Silence from Barrett's chambers was met with louder noise from the streets, the feeds, the stages. She had wielded authority, but Crockett had wielded truth, and truth travels faster than rulings, farther than robes. In living rooms across the country, people replayed the clip not once, but again and again. Families gathered around phones. Children watched their parents nod with pride. And for many, it was the first time they had ever seen someone who looked like them, who spoke like them, go toe-to-toe with the so-called untouchables of power and win. Crockett had become more than a representative. She was a mirror of possibility. And yet the story wasn't finished. Viral moments rise and fade every day, but this one carried an unusual weight. Beneath the hashtags, the memes, the laughter, and the applause, something more enduring had begun to take shape. It was a current that pulsed beneath the spectacle, a reminder that when dignity confronts arrogance, it can light a spark that burns far beyond the screen. But beyond the viral moment, something deeper was set in motion. When the noise of the chamber faded and the dust of outrage settled, what remained was not simply a headline or a trending hashtag. What remained was a truth so clear it cut through the static of politics. Dignity will always outlast arrogance, and truth will always stand taller than power. Crockett's moment was more than a rebuttal. It was a redefinition of what it means to face authority with courage. She could have met Barrett's condescension with anger. She could have mirrored insult for insult, letting the exchange spiral into another spectacle. But instead, Crockett chose the harder path: restraint, composure, and the deliberate decision to make her answer about something greater than herself. By holding firm, she proved that dignity is not weakness. It is, in fact, the most devastating counterpunch to arrogance. Her response echoed beyond the chamber because it spoke to every person who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they don't belong. It was a universal moment wrapped in the particulars of politics. Crockett was not just defending her own honor. She was speaking for teachers talked down to in staff meetings, for workers ignored by their bosses, for women and people of color told their voices mattered less. In her poise, they saw themselves. In her courage, they found validation. That is why the clash struck such a deep chord across America. It wasn't about left or right, Democrat or Republican, but about the eternal contest between arrogance and dignity, elitism and justice, silence and truth. Crockett reframed the attack, showing that power wielded with arrogance collapses under the weight of its own emptiness, while dignity, calm, unflinching, rooted in integrity, endures. America has always wrestled with this divide. From the earliest struggles for independence to the long battles for civil rights, the nation has repeatedly asked itself whether it will define itself by hierarchy or by justice. Crockett's moment was a reminder that the struggle is not over, that each generation is called to answer the same question: will we bow to arrogance, or will we insist on dignity? And in that chamber, before the eyes of the nation, she answered it. With every calm word, every unflinching glance, she reminded America of what resilience looks like. She showed that justice is not abstract. It is lived, embodied, and defended by those willing to stand tall even when the odds are stacked against them. She made clear that integrity is not fragile but unbreakable, even when confronted with centuries of elitism, dressed in robes of authority. In that chamber, Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was defending all of us. Every voice that has been silenced, every story dismissed, every truth ignored. She was the living embodiment of the American promise. That dignity, when held firmly, can outshine any title, any robe, any seat of power. The lesson is simple but profound. Authority without humility crumbles. Power without truth decays. But dignity, quiet, steady, unwavering, leaves a mark that cannot be erased. That is why Crockett's stand mattered. That is why the moment spread far beyond Washington. And that is why it will continue to inspire, long after the headlines move on. Because the clash between arrogance and dignity is not just a story of one chamber, one justice, or one representative. It is the story of America itself, written over and over again by those brave enough to speak when silence is demanded of them. And that's why this moment will not be forgotten. Justice Barrett attacked Jasmine Crockett, but in the end it wasn't just Crockett who answered. It was America. The chamber may have echoed with condescension and arrogance, but what rang louder, what carried further, was the sound of dignity striking back. This was never just about one justice or one representative. It was about what kind of nation we are willing to be, and what kind of future we are determined to build. In Crockett's composure, we saw proof that service matters more than status. In her calm defiance, we saw the reminder that justice will always outlast the swagger of authority. And in her words, we found clarity. Dignity is not weakness. It is power. The kind of power that cannot be stripped away by insults, robes, or titles. So when we look back on this moment, we will not remember the attack. We will remember the response. We will remember how a voice, steady and true, pierced through arrogance and turned a personal insult into a universal affirmation. That justice, integrity, and courage are the real foundations of America. And now the question passes to us. If you believe that dignity should always triumph over arrogance, if you believe that truth should always rise higher than power, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to a growing chorus that refuses to be silenced. Because the battle for dignity is not over. It is fought every day, in every chamber, in every workplace, in every heart. And together, we can make sure the answer is always the same. Dignity wins. Justice endures. America rises.